Wednesday morning, 8:04 a.m. Fort Wayne, Indiana. A Tim Hortons on Iceway Drive. The kind of place where nothing ever happens, except something already has. By the time Fort Wayne police arrive, a 75-year-old woman is on the floor. Unresponsive, or responsive, depending on who you ask, because that detail will become the center of a firestorm. She will be pronounced dead at the hospital hours later. No arrest has been made. The coroner hasn't released a cause of death. And a video, shot inside that restaurant, is about to be seen by hundreds of thousands of people who will all watch the same footage and reach opposite conclusions. Her name was Anita Grayson. And the question this case forces isn't just who threw the first punch. It's who we decide to protect, and why. Fort Wayne, Indiana, sits at the intersection of 3 rivers and approximately zero national attention. It is the kind of Midwestern city that exists outside the cultural frame, until it doesn't. Until Wednesday morning becomes a case study. Anita Grayson was 75 years old. Her family, speaking at a press conference days after her death, described her as the anchor, a woman of God, peaceful, rooted in her community. That is the version of Anita that her loved ones needed the world to hold on to. And grief earns that instinct. No one disputes she was someone's mother, someone's anchor. But before we can talk about what happened to Anita Grayson, we have to be willing to talk about what Anita Grayson did. Because the video, the full video, not the excerpt circulating on Facebook from an account appearing to belong to her daughter, shows something more complicated than a grandmother attacked in a coffee shop. The footage shows Grayson entering the restaurant, engaging in a verbal confrontation with employees, escalating that confrontation, and making physical contact first. She struck a 17-year-old employee in the face. That employee, along with a 20-year-old shift manager, responded. Grayson went to the floor. She became unresponsive. She never gave a statement to the police. She was transported to the hospital and pronounced dead. This is the single flaw that broke this story open. The version that spread across social media showed a segment of events. Not the beginning. Not what came before the employee came around the counter. And when you start a story at the wrong moment, the villain changes. What happened inside that Tim Hortons on Iceway Drive wasn't random. It was the end of a chain. And what happened after, the response, the community reaction, the institutional silence, is what this story is actually about. Call it the incomplete frame. It shapes who gets defended, who gets charged, and who gets buried before anyone asks the right questions. Fort Wayne police say Anita Grayson was unresponsive when they arrived. But a community leader who says he watched the full surveillance footage claims he saw her look up at an officer and respond to him. Both of those things cannot be true. The footage that spread first, more than 1,000 shares on Facebook within days, begins mid-confrontation. It shows an employee coming around the counter. It shows Grayson being struck repeatedly and knocked to the ground. That is what hundreds of thousands of people saw. That is the incomplete frame, version 1. Elderly woman attacked in a coffee shop. The fuller footage shows the incomplete frame, version 2. A woman in her mid-70s who walked into a place of business, escalated a verbal dispute, and struck a teenager. Both frames are real. Neither one is complete. Fort Wayne police were dispatched just after 8 a.m. According to their initial statement, Grayson became unresponsive before officers could obtain a statement from her. She was taken to a hospital and pronounced dead. The Allen County Coroner's Office had not yet released an official cause of death days later. Police had made no arrest. Community leader Roderick Parker, who says he privately viewed additional surveillance footage, told local media he saw an officer bend over Grayson, speak to her, and receive a verbal response from her, directly contradicting the police account that she was unresponsive on arrival. Parker also claimed officers never physically checked Grayson's condition after she collapsed. No pulse check. No breathing assessment. No visible medical response until paramedics arrived. The restaurant's dining room was closed. Employees declined to comment. Officers stood by through the afternoon. And on social media, 2 competing movements were already forming. One calling for justice for Anita Grayson, one arguing the employees had every right to defend themselves. What neither movement was asking yet was the structural question. What happens inside the gap between a person collapsing on a floor and the people with authority to help her actually doing so? The employees have not been arrested. The coroner hasn't confirmed the cause of death. And the only people who've seen the complete surveillance footage are the police and one community leader, who says the family needs to prepare themselves before watching it. Fort Wayne police opened an investigation into what they classified as a battery. That classification matters. Battery implies a perpetrator. In the early hours after this incident, the implied perpetrator, based on the footage circulating on social media, was the employee who came around the counter. But investigators work from full context, not viral clips. And the full context, as described by multiple people who have seen the complete surveillance footage, shows Grayson initiating physical contact before any employee left the counter area. The legal question of self-defense is not simple. A 17-year-old employee struck by a 75-year-old customer has the legal right to defend herself. The degree of force applied, relative to the threat posed, is where the law gets complicated. What level of response is proportionate when the person striking you is elderly, even if they struck first? That question sits with the Allen County Prosecutor's Office. And weeks passed without a public answer. Forensic pathologist Dr. Valerie Aston, if retained to review the case, would note that determining causation in a death following a physical altercation involving an elderly person requires ruling out pre-existing cardiac conditions, trauma-induced events, and stress responses. The coroner's delay in releasing the cause of death reflects exactly that complexity. The geography of this case is also specific. The Tim Hortons on Iceway Drive is a franchise location, not corporate-owned. That distinction, unremarkable to most customers, becomes legally significant the moment a death occurs on the premises. Liability flows to the franchise owner. Insurance, legal exposure, and any civil claims follow that ownership structure, not the Tim Hortons brand. Grayson's family retained legal representation. Community leaders called for the district attorney's involvement. National civil rights organizations signaled they were monitoring the case. The restaurant's ownership remained publicly silent. Roderick Parker, the community leader who viewed the full surveillance footage, said one thing no one has challenged. The family should prepare themselves before seeing it. He didn't say it was ambiguous. He said they'd be shocked. Here is what a week of investigation produced publicly. A police statement that described a battery, a coroner's office that had not determined the cause of death, a restaurant dining room that stayed closed, and 2 employees who declined to comment. Here is what the community produced. Hundreds of comments, protest presence outside the restaurant, and at least one man who drove to the location specifically to stand outside on camera and announce he would never buy a product there. These 2 things, institutional silence and community noise, were not in conversation with each other. They were running parallel, neither one producing answers. The family's press conference added one verifiable detail. Fort Wayne police agreed to let them privately view additional surveillance footage. Do not release it publicly. View it privately. The distinction is significant. Full public release of surveillance footage during an open investigation is not standard procedure. But in a case where the version of events being shared publicly is incomplete, the decision to withhold the complete footage from public view feeds exactly the kind of narrative fracture this case produced. Community leader Parker made one specific claim about police conduct, that officers arrived on scene, interacted with Grayson verbally, receiving a response from her, and never physically assessed her condition. If accurate, this is not a racial allegation. It is a protocol allegation. Emergency response to a person on the floor following a physical altercation has a standard. That standard exists because the time between collapse and assessment is the variable that determines outcomes. Parker said Grayson looked up at an officer and responded. The police said she was unresponsive when they arrived. Both accounts cannot be accurate. Nobody has subpoenaed the officer's bodycam footage. Nobody has publicly asked whether those officers were trained in emergency medical response, or whether that training was current. Nobody has asked the Fort Wayne Police Department whether the response timeline from dispatch to medical contact met department standards. Those are not emotional questions. They are procedural ones. And they remain unanswered. Meanwhile, the social media conversation fractured entirely along racial lines, which is exactly what happens when the institutions responsible for producing answers produce silence instead. When facts don't fill the frame, narrative does. And narrative is always shaped by the lens people already carry. The incomplete frame was no longer just about the video. It was about the entire institutional response to Anita Grayson lying on that floor. The franchise owner of the Tim Hortons on Iceway Drive has never spoken publicly. Not once. And in a case where liability is civil and criminal, that silence is not neutral. The legal architecture of this case moves on 3 tracks simultaneously. First, criminal. Fort Wayne Police and the Allen County Prosecutor's Office must determine whether the employees who struck Anita Grayson committed criminal battery, or whether their response to being physically attacked first constitutes lawful self-defense. Given that Grayson initiated physical contact, the self-defense argument is not frivolous. But the cause of death matters enormously here. If the coroner determines that trauma from the altercation directly caused or accelerated Grayson's death, the charge calculus changes. Battery becomes a very different conversation. Second, civil. Grayson's family will almost certainly file a wrongful death claim. The target is not the employees individually. The target is the franchise owner, the entity with insurance, assets, and legal exposure. The argument, a duty of care existed. That duty was breached. That breach contributed to her death. Whether that argument succeeds depends heavily on what the coroner says. Third, the police response. If Parker's account is accurate, that officers interacted with a responsive Grayson and did not physically assess her condition, then that opens a separate line of inquiry into first responder protocol. This track has received the least attention and carries potentially the most systemic significance. Here is the system failure this case exposed, stated plainly. There is no national standard requiring law enforcement officers responding to a physical altercation to initiate emergency medical assessment of any person on scene. That function is formally assigned to EMS. In practice, the gap between police arrival and EMS contact, measured in minutes, can be the difference between life and death for an elderly person who has suffered physical trauma or cardiac event. Fort Wayne has not publicly stated when EMS arrived relative to police. That timestamp has not been released. There is also no mechanism, at the restaurant, the police department, or the county level, that specifically addresses what duty of care franchise employees owe a customer who becomes a combatant. The employee handbook at a fast food franchise does not prepare a 17-year-old for the legal and moral weight of that moment. And there's this: Anita Grayson was 75 years old, and she struck a teenager in the face inside a restaurant. That fact does not diminish her death. It does not make her family's grief less real. But the incomplete frame, the one that showed only the aftermath, only the elderly woman on the floor, shaped the first week of this story. It shaped who received threats online. It shaped which narrative received national amplification. The employees at Tim Hortons on Iceway Drive are not public figures. They are teenagers and young adults who went to work and had a morning that became something they will carry for years. Their silence is not guilt. It is, most likely, legal counsel. And the franchise owner's silence? That one is harder to explain. Weeks after Anita Grayson died on the floor of a Fort Wayne Tim Hortons, the Allen County Coroner's Office had not released an official cause of death. The Fort Wayne Police Department had made no arrest. The franchise owner had issued no public statement. The employees remained silent on legal advice. The family had viewed additional surveillance footage privately. Community leader Roderick Parker had publicly described what he saw. The two accounts, police and Parker, had never been formally reconciled. This is where the case stood. What this case actually produced, beyond the specific facts, was a demonstration of how completely an incomplete frame can replace an investigation. The version of events that spread fastest was the version that began in the middle. It was emotionally coherent, visually compelling, and factually insufficient. It generated thousands of shares, community protests, and national attention before the coroner had finished preliminary work. The speed of the narrative outran the speed of the facts. That is not a racial phenomenon. It is a media architecture phenomenon. It happens in cases involving every demographic, in every direction. What racial dynamics did, legitimately and demonstrably, shape which communities amplified which version of the incomplete frame? That is a different, and more precise, conversation than the one that was actually happening online. Anita Grayson deserves to have the real question asked about what happened after she hit that floor. Her family deserves a coroner's report and a clear timeline of the first responder response. Those are not inflammatory questions. They are the minimum standard for any death investigation. The employees involved deserve to have the full footage considered, not the fragment. Whatever legal determination follows, it should follow from complete information. Fort Wayne deserves a direct answer from its police department about what protocol governs emergency medical assessment when officers arrive before EMS. None of those questions has been answered. Anita Grayson was 75 years old. She was somebody's mother, somebody's anchor. She was also a person who made choices inside a Tim Hortons on a Wednesday morning that contributed to a chain of events nobody walked away from clean. The incomplete frame is what we do when the facts are slow and the grief is immediate. It is human. It is also dangerous, because it assigns blame before the investigation is finished, and it shapes what questions we think to ask. The question in this case is still waiting for someone to ask out loud. Should a responding officer's duty to initiate emergency medical contact be governed by written protocol, not judgment, especially when the person on that floor is elderly? That answer will not come from social media. It will come from Fort Wayne City Council, from the police department's use of force and response review board, or from a civil lawsuit that forces the department to produce its internal response timeline in discovery. We are watching every one of those tracks. When the coroner releases the cause of death, everything in this case shifts. Subscribe, because that release is the moment this story either closes or opens into something much larger. Do you believe Fort Wayne officers had a legal and moral obligation to physically assess Anita Grayson's condition before EMS arrived? Or does that responsibility belong entirely to paramedics? Drop your answer below. The coroner's report is still pending. The moment it lands, we'll be here.